He didn't know her name. Just saw a woman in a worn military jacket and two little girls huddled together in the cold outside a diner. She wasn't begging. She wasn't crying. She just sat there, still proud and completely out of options. And that's when he said it. "You're coming with me." What began as a simple act of kindness would uncover a past no one saw coming and ignite a love that would rebuild them all. If stories of redemption, quiet courage, and the miracles born from kindness speak to your heart, take a moment to subscribe and settle in. This isn't just a love story. It's a journey of healing. And it all starts with 4 unexpected words. The wind howled down from the mountains like a beast uncaged, biting through Luke Hartley's flannel shirt as he stepped out of the diner. Snowflakes stung his cheeks, not quite snow yet, but the kind of icy drizzle Montana spit at you in early March, vindictive, cold, and personal. He tightened his grip on the paper bag of hot food and turned toward his truck. It had been a long day at the lumber mill, and all he wanted was to get home, heat up dinner for Eli, and maybe catch a few innings of the Mariners game. But something, a flicker of motion in the corner of his eye, stopped him. There, under the eave of the diner, where the dim yellow light barely reached, sat a woman in a military jacket, her shoulders hunched against the cold. Her arms were wrapped tightly around 2 little girls who couldn't have been more than 5 or 6. Identical red hats covered their small heads, and their feet swung just above the slush-covered ground, bare except for mismatched socks. The 3 of them were silent, still, as if afraid even breath might draw attention. Luke's boots crunched in the snow as he shifted his weight. He'd seen that look before, the guarded stillness, the exhaustion buried behind pride. It was the same look he'd had in the mirror after Marcy died, the same one he'd seen in the shelter when he used to volunteer. He didn't mean to approach. Really, he didn't. But his feet had other ideas. "Miss," he said softly, careful not to startle her. "You folks okay?" The woman looked up. Her eyes met his green-gray, sharp but tired, in a way that spoke of too many battles fought off the field. Her jaw tightened. She didn't answer. Luke hesitated, then slowly crouched down a few feet away, keeping his posture low and unthreatening. He wasn't wearing a badge, wasn't a social worker or a preacher. Just a guy in a plaid shirt who knew what it looked like when someone had run out of places to go. "My name's Luke," he said. "I've got a house a few miles out. Got a little boy 7 years old. Made too much food tonight." He held out the bag gently as if offering peace. "There's fried chicken and mashed potatoes. Maybe some warmth if you want it." The woman stared at him, then down at her daughters, then back at him. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Then he said it 4 words, without thinking, from a place deeper than charity. "You're coming with me." Silence fell like the snow around them. One of the girls looked up at her mother and whispered something too soft to hear. The woman nodded almost imperceptibly. Luke stood and stepped back, giving her space. She rose slowly, balancing one child in each arm. Her movements were stiff, cautious not from distrust, but from a fatigue that seemed to go bone deep. As they approached the truck, Luke opened the passenger door, laid his coat over the front seat, and watched as she helped the girls in. They didn't speak. They didn't cry. They simply held hands and looked straight ahead, as if waiting for the next test of survival. He started the engine and turned the heater on full blast. The woman didn't look at him as he drove, but when they passed the last streetlight on the edge of town, she finally spoke. "My name's Grace." He nodded. "Nice to meet you, Grace." There was a pause. Then, "Captain Grace Morgan, United States Army." Luke glanced at her. She wasn't boasting. It was just a fact, a title that no longer came with a paycheck, a salute, or even a home. "I figured," he said quietly. You still carry yourself like someone who's been in command." Her mouth quirked slightly, almost a smile, but not quite. The girls had fallen asleep against her shoulders, trusting this stranger with the kind of faith only children could still afford. Luke's house came into view, a modest log home, nestled against the forest line, smoke curling from the chimney like a welcome sign. He parked in the driveway and turned to her. "Come on in. We'll get you all cleaned up and fed. You can figure out your next step in the morning." Grace didn't move for a long second. Then finally she nodded. Inside, Eli blinked at the unexpected visitors, but his father's calm demeanor told him everything was okay. Luke introduced them, and before long the children were sitting cross-legged on the rug, sharing chicken tenders and juice boxes like old friends. Eli handed them action figures and offered to let them sleep in his room. Grace stood at the doorway, still in her boots, unsure whether she was trespassing or dreaming. "You're safe here," Luke said gently. "No questions tonight. Just warmth and rest." She looked at him, then not with gratitude, not yet, but with a flicker of something he hadn't seen in her eyes before, a tiny spark of belief. That maybe this wasn't the end of the road. Maybe it was the first real stop. Outside, the storm finally broke loose, rain drumming hard against the roof. But inside that little home in Montana, for the first time in a long time, 3 strangers weren't running anymore. They had been invited in, and they stayed. Luke stood in the hallway, towel in hand, staring at the closed door to the guest room. He'd put fresh linens on the bed, stacked 3 soft blankets at the foot, and left a space heater humming in the corner. It wasn't much, just a small room with a creaky dresser and a nightstand, missing a drawer. But it was warm, safe, and his. He heard the soft creak of the floorboards behind him. Turning, he found Grace standing there, one daughter asleep in her arms, the other clinging to the hem of her coat. She still hadn't taken off her boots. Her hair was damp from melted snow, and her cheeks held the flush of exhaustion more than cold. "This way," Luke set his voice low. He opened the door and stepped aside, letting her pass into the space. She laid the sleeping girl gently on the bed and coaxed the other to crawl under the covers. No good night songs, no fairy tales, just a quiet kiss to each forehead and a whispered, "I'm right here." Luke watched her movements, methodical, protective, but tender. She sat at the edge of the mattress for a moment, staring at the wall, as if afraid the room might vanish. "You should rest too," he said softly. "You look like you haven't in days." She glanced at him. "I haven't." He nodded, unsure what to say next. He didn't want to pry, didn't want to scare her back into silence. So instead he offered the only thing he could think of. "There's tea, if you want." She hesitated, then rose, slowly pulling the door almost shut behind her. In the kitchen, the kettle whistled softly on the stove. Luke poured 2 mugs and slid one toward her as she sat at the table. It was the first real moment they'd had to look at each other. She looked older than she probably was, not in a worn-out way, but in the way people looked when they'd lived too many lives in too short a time. Her eyes were steady, alert, but lined with fatigue. The kind of fatigue that didn't come from lack of sleep. It came from carrying too much for too long. "They're beautiful girls," he said. Grace nodded. "Ella and June. They just turned 6. Luke smiled. "Twins identical, except for the dimples. Ella's are deeper. She thinks that makes her the boss." He chuckled. It was the first time he'd seen her smile, even just a flicker. "And your son?" she asked. "Eli. 7 going on 70. He talks to trees and reads cookbooks for fun." She blinked, almost laughed. "Sounds like a good kid." "He is. We're figuring things out. Lost his mom 3 years ago. Car fire." Grace didn't offer a pitying look, just a quiet nod of understanding. He appreciated that. For a moment, the kitchen fell into silence, filled only by the ticking of the old wall clock and the distant hum of the heater in the guest room. Luke leaned back, watching her hands wrap around the mug. She held it like it was the only warm thing she'd touched in weeks. "You're not the first person I've helped," he said after a while. "But you might be the first who didn't ask for it." "I didn't come looking for charity." "I know. I didn't even mean to stop there," she added. "The girls were hungry, and we saw the light. I didn't think anyone would notice us." Luke sipped his tea. "I didn't notice you. I saw you." That gave her pause. Her grip on the mug loosened just slightly. She looked down, then back up, meeting his gaze more directly this time. "You don't know anything about me," she said quietly. "No," he agreed. "But I know enough." Grace exhaled a breath that sounded more like surrender than relief. "I don't know how long we'll stay," she admitted. "Just a few days, maybe. Until I figure out the next step." "There's no clock on kindness," Luke said. "Stay as long as you need." For the first time, her posture relaxed. Not fully, but enough that her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, and her fingers stopped trembling. She glanced toward the hallway, then back at him. "They haven't slept in a warm bed in weeks," she said. Luke nodded. "Then tonight's a good night." They sat there a while longer, sipping tea, not saying much. It was the kind of silence that didn't need filling. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows. Inside, the house held its breath around them. Two souls not yet healed, but no longer entirely broken. Before she stood to return to her daughters, Grace paused. "I served 12 years, she said softly. 4 overseas. I lost good people. Came home, tried to rebuild. My husband couldn't handle who I was anymore." Luke didn't respond right away. He let the words settle heavy and raw. "You're still rebuilding," he said. "That's all right. Bricks take time." She gave a small nod, and for the first time he saw something flicker behind the weariness. Not hope. Not yet. But maybe the space for it. As she disappeared down the hall, Luke leaned back in his chair, staring at the steam rising from his half-empty cup. The house had been too quiet for too long. Now, for the first time in years, it didn't feel empty. It felt like something was beginning. He didn't know what. But it had started with 4 words and a door that stayed open. Morning broke quietly over the Montana horizon, laying a soft, silver light across the pine trees that rimmed Luke's property. He stood at the kitchen sink, watching the sky shift from gray to pale blue, while the coffee percolated behind him. It had snowed overnight light and dry, leaving a dusting on the front steps, and a peace in the air he hadn't felt in years. He didn't hear Grace enter. But when he turned, she was there standing barefoot on the kitchen tiles, in an oversized flannel shirt that hung just past her knees. His flannel shirt. She must have found it in the laundry basket. Her hair was damp at the ends, tied back in a loose braid. Her face was bare of makeup, and in the morning light, she looked both older and softer than the soldier he'd met under the diner's eave. "Morning," she said, voice raspy. Luke poured her a cup of coffee and slid it across the counter. "Hope flannel suits you," he said with a hint of a smile. "It's warm," she replied, taking the mug and wrapping her fingers around it. That's all that matters these days. They stood for a moment in companionable silence. From the living room, faint giggles filtered through Eli and the girls, no doubt plotting something with crayons and blankets. "I forgot how early kids get up," Grace said, sipping her coffee. "They've been up since 6, Luke said. I heard them building a pillow fort. I didn't have the heart to stop them." She smiled faintly. "They haven't laughed like that in weeks." Luke studied her for a beat. "You either." Grace looked down at her coffee. He didn't push further. He'd learned after Marcy died that silence sometimes spoke better than words. And that trust, real trust, grew in quiet places. After breakfast, Luke invited Grace out to the porch. The air was crisp, clean, and smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine. He handed her a second mug of coffee and motioned to the swing at the edge of the deck. She hesitated, then sat. He sat beside her, not too close, let the silence settle between them until it felt less like a wall and more like a blanket. "You ever serve?" she asked finally. He nodded. "Not military. Fire service. 18 years. Engine Company 7 Bozeman." Her eyes softened. "That's service." He gave a small shrug. "Saw my share of hell. Not the kind with IEDs, but enough to know what a scream in the dark sounds like." Grace sipped her coffee slowly. The porch creaked under their combined weight. Birds chirped tentatively in the trees, testing the edges of spring. "I used to think I'd come home to something solid," she said. "We had a plan, me and Jason. He was infantry 3rd tour when we got married. After he left the Army, he started building custom bikes. I got promoted. We had the twins. I thought we were bulletproof." Luke didn't interrupt. "Turns out coming home can break you worse than combat," she added quietly. He started drinking. Got mean. Said I was more soldier than wife. I tried to hold things together for the girls, but when he left, he took more than money and stability. He took whatever was left of me. Luke exhaled. "That's a hell of a thing to come back to." "It's funny," Grace said bitterly. "I could navigate minefields, but I couldn't survive my own living room." Luke turned to face her fully. "Survival doesn't always look like a medal. Sometimes it's just waking up and getting your kids dressed." "You survived, Grace." She looked at him, really looked at him. "So did you." He nodded. "Marcy was my compass. Losing her. I wandered for a while. I think Eli anchored me without even knowing it. Kids are like that. They don't know how much they save you while you're trying to save them." She took a breath deeper this time. "Not just air, but space. I don't talk about Jason, or the Army. Not to anyone." "I won't ask again," Luke said. But she shook her head. "No. I want to. I just don't remember how." A beat passed. Then another. "You don't need to tell your whole story today," Luke said gently. "But if you ever want to sit out here and say nothing, I'll sit with you." Grace smiled. It was small, tired, but real. Later that afternoon, they watched the kids run laps around the backyard, making up rules for a game involving snowballs and pine cones. Grace helped Eli climb a low branch, while Luke pushed one of the girls on the swing. It wasn't a perfect family. It wasn't even a defined one. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like something close. That night, as Luke locked the front door and turned off the porch light, he passed the hallway where Grace's room sat. The door was cracked open just slightly, enough for light to spill onto the floorboards. And he realized something with startling clarity. He didn't know how long she'd stay. But he was no longer afraid of her leaving, because somehow, amid all the silence and unspoken grief, they were beginning to build something. Not out of romance, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. Two people who had once lived in command, now learning to live in kindness. The smell of sizzling butter and flour filled the kitchen before sunrise. Luke, groggy-eyed and barefoot, rubbed the sleep from his eyes as he followed the scent. He paused in the doorway, blinking in surprise. Grace stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with surprising grace for someone who 2 days ago looked like she hadn't touched a spatula in months. She wore a borrowed hoodie, Eli's oversized Montana State sweatshirt, and a pair of flannel pajama pants, cinched with a safety pin. Her braid was loose over one shoulder, and there was flour on her cheek. She looked for the first time not like a soldier or a survivor, but simply a mother. "Morning," she said, not turning around. "Hope you don't mind. The kids were up. I figured I'd make breakfast." Luke leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "I've never minded waking up to pancakes. This some sort of military tactic to gain control of the household." She glanced back, a smirk playing at the corner of her mouth. It's phase 1. Phase 2 involves bacon and soft power, he chuckled. Remind me to surrender before lunch. The girls were already at the table coloring in silence content. Eli sat between them wide-eyed, as if he couldn't believe his morning luck. Luke set the table while Grace worked. When they finally sat to eat, he watched her closely, not out of suspicion, but something deeper. Fascination, maybe. Or respect. She hadn't spoken much the day before. But now she laughed quietly at Eli's dinosaur impressions and reached to tuck June's hair behind her ear with the gentlest touch. It struck him how quickly the house had filled with life. It hadn't been this full since before Marcy. Before silence became normal. As the children finished and raced off to build a pillow fort in the living room, Grace began to clear the plates. You cooked, you don't clean, Luke said, reaching for the dishes. She handed him the sponge anyway. I don't like owing people. He paused. You're not a debt. That gave her pause. The kitchen grew quiet again, comfortable but also a little brittle. Grace leaned against the counter watching the window, where snow still dusted the pine branches like powdered sugar. Luke dried a plate, set it on the rack, and said, I used to dream about moments like this. Noise in the kitchen, dishes clinking, kids arguing about whose drawing is better. Grace said nothing. I'm glad you're here, he added. All of you. For a moment he thought she might thank him, but instead she said, I have nightmares. Luke didn't move. Not every night. But sometimes she went on voice low and measured as if reading off a damage report. Sometimes I wake up and forget where I am. I reach for my weapon, or I call for backup. The girls are used to it. They don't cry anymore. They just wait until I breathe normal again. Luke set the towel down. Grace continued. Jason, my husband, he couldn't handle it. Said I brought the war home. Said I changed. But it wasn't war that changed me. It was surviving it. You shouldn't have had to carry that alone, Luke said quietly. I did, she replied. Still do. Not here. That made her look up. He wasn't trying to fix her. He wasn't promising anything. He was simply present. And in that presence, there was weight. I know I'm not easy, she said, almost defensively. I'm not looking for easy, he said. I'm looking for real. She looked away, then back out the window, blinking hard. I don't know how to be real anymore. Then we'll figure it out. Together. Or not. No rules here, Grace. Just time. And kindness when we can manage it. She let out a soft, tired breath. You talk like someone who's learned this the hard way. I have. They stood in that kitchen for a while, two veterans of different battles, different wounds. The sun crept higher, casting a warm light across the floor, across their feet, across everything that had once been cold. Then came a scream from the living room. Luke and Grace bolted, adrenaline spiking. But it was only June, dramatically upset, that Eli had knocked over a pillow tower. Grace scooped her up, kissing the girl's hair. You're safe, she whispered. It's just a game. Luke watched her, her arms steady, her voice calm, and it hit him more than ever that Grace wasn't broken. She was rebuilding. Brick by brick. Later that afternoon, Luke found something in the laundry. Grace had done something small and unexpected. A weathered rank insignia, her army captain's pin tucked in the pocket of the hoodie. The metal was scratched, dulled by time and wear. He turned it over in his hand, then placed it gently on the mantel above the fireplace. When Grace saw it there, she didn't say a word. She didn't need to. That evening, after the kids were asleep, Grace walked past the mantel, paused, then turned back. You didn't ask, she said. Didn't have to, Luke replied. That pin says enough. She stepped closer. You're not like other men I've met. That's probably good, he said, his voice dry. She didn't smile this time, but her voice was softer than before. Thank you for letting us stay. Luke met her eyes. Stay as long as you need. This house is better with you in it. And though neither said it, both knew something had shifted. The woman in uniform was still there. But now she was also Grace. The late afternoon sun filtered through the curtains in the living room, painting golden slats across the rug, where crayons and coloring books lay scattered like confetti. Grace sat cross-legged on the floor, her back resting against the couch, half watching the kids and half lost in thought. June and Ella huddled over their paper, whispering and giggling like they were planning state secrets. Eli sat nearby with a dinosaur book, though his eyes kept drifting to Ella, as if amazed someone so small could draw with such intensity. Luke entered with a tray of grilled cheese sandwiches, his plaid sleeves rolled up hair, tousled from splitting firewood. Okay, lunch is served. Hope someone likes burnt edges. June gave a cheer and dashed over. Burnt edges are the best, Eli chimed in. Grace smiled faintly. She hadn't eaten lunch at a coffee table in years, hadn't seen the girls this relaxed since before Jason left. Come on, Luke said, nudging her with a plate. You skip another meal I'm calling social services. Grace gave him a mock glare. I'd like to see them deal with me. He sat beside her close enough to feel the warmth of her arm against his. It wasn't flirtation. It was familiarity. A quiet recognition that they'd begun to lean toward each other without even noticing. As they ate, Ella handed Grace a piece of paper. Finished, she said proudly. Grace took the drawing, expecting another castle or unicorn. But when she looked, her breath caught in her throat. It was a house square and simple with smoke, curling from the chimney and snow on the roof. In front stood 6 stick figures, hand in hand. 3 tall, 3 small. Each had names scrawled beneath: Luke, Grace, Eli, Ella, June, and one name circled in red, Crayon Mommy. Grace swallowed hard. Her fingers trembled slightly as she ran them across the paper. She looked at Ella. You drew all of us. Ella nodded. I made us a family, like when we used to be one, but better now. Grace didn't speak. She couldn't. Luke leaned in to see the drawing. His expression softened, and he didn't try to hide the emotion behind it. That's a masterpiece, he said gently. June climbed into Grace's lap. Do you like it? Mommy. Grace blinked. That word. Mommy. She hadn't heard it without pain in so long. Jason had made it feel like a lie. Like she didn't deserve it if she wasn't home every night baking cookies and wearing pearls. But here now, her daughter said it with joy, with hope. Grace pressed a kiss to June's forehead and whispered, I love it. The rest of the afternoon passed in a gentle blur. Laughter filled the house. Board games were played, socks were lost, and somehow a pillow fight erupted in the hallway. Luke didn't stop them. He joined in. That night after the kids were asleep, Grace sat by the fireplace, the drawing resting on her lap. She traced it again and again, memorizing the curve of each crayon line. Luke entered 2 mugs of cocoa in hand. He handed her one and sat beside her on the hearth. The fire cast flickers of light against the stone, making shadows dance across their faces. Eli did something like that once, he said. A few weeks after Marcy died, drew a picture of our family with her still in it. I kept it, still folded in my wallet. Grace looked at him. How did you get through it? I didn't, Luke said honestly. Not really. I just woke up every morning and did the next thing. Made breakfast, folded laundry, answered math homework I didn't understand. And eventually, the pain got quieter. He looked at her, then his eyes not just kind, but knowing. Losing someone isn't a moment, he added. It's a process. 1,000 little surrenders. And sometimes, if you're lucky, someone walks in and helps you carry the pieces. Grace turned the drawing over, showing him the back. There, Ella had written in crooked, hopeful letters, "Don't go away again, Mommy." Luke didn't speak. He just reached over, rested his hand lightly on hers. "I thought I was done," she whispered. "After Jason. After the army. I thought I had nothing left to give." Luke squeezed her hand just enough to steady her. "You're not done," he said softly. "You're just beginning." Grace blinked, eyes stinging. "I'm scared." "So am I." They sat in the silence, the kind that comes after truth has been spoken aloud. Not the kind that hurts, but the kind that heals. The fireplace crackled beside them. Upstairs, the children slept in tangled piles of blankets and dreams. And in that little house in Montana, a woman who had been a captain, a wife, a fighter, and a shadow, was slowly becoming something else, a mother again. A woman again. Herself. By the time the warning hit the local radio station, the wind had already begun its slow whispering crawl through the pine trees. Montana was famous for its sudden spring storms, but this one moved differently, quiet and fast, like a rumor with teeth. Luke stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the clouds roll in low and thick. The horizon was bruised gray. He tapped his thumb against the cup, calculating whether they had enough firewood stacked, whether the backup generator still worked. Behind him, the door creaked open. "You feel it too?" Grace asked. He turned. She wore her coat, half-zipped hair tucked into a knit cap, eyes narrowed against the wind. She looked like a woman bracing for more than just weather. "Barometer's dropping fast," Luke said. "Could be ugly." "I've seen worse," she replied. He looked at her sideways. "In Kabul or in Kansas?" Grace smirked faintly. "Both." Luke chuckled, but the moment passed quickly. His smile faded. "We should check on Mrs. Lambert next door. She's still got that oxygen rig, and I don't think her grandsons visit much anymore." "I'll go," Grace said immediately. "You sure I've got boots, and legs, and instincts?" He hesitated. She added, "I need to do something." Luke nodded. "I'll keep the kettle warm." Grace moved fast. She always had. Within 10 minutes, she was crossing the field toward Mrs. Lambert's tiny bungalow, bundled in Eli's old parka, carrying a thermos of hot tea and a flashlight in her coat pocket. The sky cracked open with a low guttural rumble. Luke stood by the window watching her disappear into the wind. An hour passed. The storm arrived like a wall sleet, slicing sideways trees, bending the temperature, dropping in seconds. The lights flickered. The kids huddled on the couch under a pile of quilts, whispering stories, and passing a flashlight like a totem. He was reaching for his boots when the door burst open. Grace stepped inside, soaked cheeks red, dragging a bundle of blankets behind her. It wasn't blankets. It was Mrs. Lambert. She lost power. Grace gasped. Space heater was out. I found her under 3 quilts with a flashlight in her mouth, so she wouldn't drop it while she tried to fix the fuse. Luke helped lower the woman onto the couch. Grace peeled off her coat boots, squelching as she moved. I carried her the last 100 yards, she muttered. She was light. Mostly determination. Mrs. Lambert looked up, eyes wide. "That woman's a damn general," Luke grinned. "Close." Eli ran to get extra pillows. Ella and June offered Mrs. Lambert juice boxes and blankets, treating her like royalty. Grace stood back, catching her breath, hands on her knees. Luke walked over, handed her a towel. "You okay?" She nodded. It felt good. Doing something that mattered. He looked at her. Hair damp, sleeves rolled up, cheeks glowing from cold and effort. She wasn't just helping. She was coming back to life. "You know," he said, "I think you scared the storm more than it scared you." She laughed, then winced. Maybe. Or maybe I just remembered who I used to be. Later that evening, the lights returned with a hesitant hum. Mrs. Lambert slept peacefully in Eli's room, a hot water bottle pressed to her side. The kids had fallen asleep in the living room, a fortress of cushions and soft snores. Luke found Grace sitting at the kitchen table drying her boots near the heater. He placed 2 mugs down, same as always. "Local news mentioned your name," he said, sliding over his phone. Said a former Army captain rescued a disabled senior during the power outage. She groaned. "You called the press?" "No. I think Mrs. Lambert did. She probably wants you to run for mayor." Grace shook her head. "I'm no hero, Luke." He leaned back in his chair. "No, you're not. But you're exactly what this town didn't know it needed." She sipped her cocoa, staring into the mug like it might tell her something she didn't already know. "I miss that feeling," she said after a long pause. "The feeling of doing something that meant more than just surviving." Luke nodded. "Then maybe it's time to stop just surviving." She looked at him. Really looked. For the first time since she arrived, her guard lowered completely. Her eyes didn't just soften, they shined. With gratitude. With the beginning of trust. Maybe more. "I haven't felt like myself in years," she whispered. "You don't have to go back to who you were," Luke said. "You can build something new." The wind outside quieted like it too was waiting for her answer. Grace reached across the table and touched the back of his hand. "Then maybe I'll start here." And in that small kitchen, after a day of chaos and rescue and wet boots and frightened kids, something shifted. Not loudly, but real. The storm had passed, and what remained, what always remains, if you let it, was the possibility of rebuilding. Together. The snow had melted into soft puddles along the edge of Luke's porch by the time the mail arrived, a rare sunny afternoon in early spring that coaxed green from the grass and stirred hope in the air. Luke walked back from the mailbox with a stack of envelopes in one hand, flicking through bills and flyers without much interest. But one letter stopped him. It was addressed to Grace Morgan, handwritten in a tight slanted script. No return address, but the postmark read, Fort Lewis, WA. He paused, staring at it. Grace was in the backyard, kneeling in the soil near the fence, showing the girls how to plant peas in shallow furrows. Ella was asking if flowers and vegetables could grow in the same place. June was more interested in whether worms could be kept as pets. Luke held the envelope in his hand a while longer. Then he walked out and gently handed it to Grace. "Mail call, Captain," he said lightly. She looked up, wiped her hand on her jeans, and took the letter without much thought. But the moment her eyes scanned the handwriting, something in her face changed. Just a flicker, but enough for Luke to see it. Recognition. Fear. Memory. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she tucked it into her pocket and resumed digging. Later after dinner, after the kids were asleep, Grace sat alone on the porch steps, the letter resting on her lap. The stars were out in full force, scattered across the black sky like forgotten promises. Luke joined her quietly, bringing a blanket and 2 mugs of chamomile tea. "I didn't mean to read anything," he said. "Just saw your name." "I know." He didn't push. Grace traced the edge of the envelope with her thumb. "It's from Staff Sergeant Malden," she said eventually. "He was in my company overseas. We haven't spoken since the last deployment. He was the one who pulled me out of the wreckage." Luke stayed still. He didn't need the details to understand. Grace inhaled slowly, then opened the envelope. Her eyes scanned the page in the moonlight lips, moving faintly with the rhythm of the words. When she was done, she sat in silence, letting the letter rest on her knees. "He said they had a memorial," she murmured. "For Harris, the one we lost. Said they finally found his tags in the rubble after all these years." Luke glanced at her. "I should have been there," she said, voice cracking. "You didn't know." "I didn't want to know," she whispered. "I left everything behind when I came back. Jason couldn't handle my grief. He didn't want the army in our house. He said if I ever brought it up, he'd leave. Her hands curled into fists, so I stopped talking. About everything. I buried it so deep I forgot what it felt like to grieve out loud. Luke reached over his hand covering hers. Grace didn't pull away. He said they missed me. She continued, that no one ever called me a coward, that they still talk about me like I'm part of the unit. You are. She looked up at him, eyes glistening. I don't feel like I belong anywhere. You belong here. The words came out softer than he intended, but heavier too. They didn't float. They landed. I'm tired, Luke, she admitted. Tired of pretending I'm fine. Tired of being strong. Tired of waking up every day and not knowing if I'm a memory or a mistake. You're neither, he said gently. You're Grace. You're a mother, a soldier, a woman who carried more than most, and still shows up every morning to make pancakes and kiss scraped knees. She laughed a soft, broken sound. You make it sound poetic. No, he said. I make it sound true. The porch creaked as she leaned into him, her shoulder against his. The blanket shifted around them, the scent of chamomile rising between them like a shared secret. I think I want to write him back, she said. You should. She was quiet for a long time. Then I don't know what to say. Start with thank you, Luke offered. Then maybe tell him what's true. That you're still standing. That your girls are drawing pictures of families again. That a guy in Montana makes terrible coffee but listens well. Grace turned her face toward him, the lines of sadness and strength interwoven so tightly they were indistinguishable. Why do you do it? She asked. Why help me like this? Luke's eyes didn't waver. Because someone once helped me, and I couldn't repay them. So now. I pass it on. She nodded slowly. Then impulsively she leaned over and pressed a kiss to his cheek. Not romantic. Not yet. But grateful. Grounded. She stood holding the letter close and whispered, Good night, Luke. As she disappeared into the house, Luke stayed on the porch, staring up at the stars. Some letters were written on paper. Some were written in moments. And this one, this chapter in Grace's life was just beginning to unfold. The next morning was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that clings to the walls of a house when something is about to change. Luke noticed it the moment he walked into the kitchen. The usual clatter of cereal bowls was missing, and the smell of fresh coffee had been replaced by the sterile stillness of untouched air. Eli was playing Legos alone on the rug, unusually subdued. The girls were nowhere in sight. Luke found them in the hallway, sitting cross-legged outside the guest room door. Ella was hugging her knees. June looked like she was trying not to cry. What's going on? He asked gently. Mommy's packing, Ella whispered. Luke's breath caught. He knocked once, then opened the door. Grace was kneeling by the bed, folding clothes with robotic precision. The room looked like it had that first night sparse temporary, like no one had ever meant to stay. I need to go, she said, without turning around. Luke stepped inside, closing the door behind him. I thought we were past this. I thought so too, she said, zipping the suitcase shut. But that letter, it reminded me of everything I left behind. Everything I never finished. I can't move forward if I don't face what's back there. Luke nodded slowly. So you're going back to Washington, I don't know. Maybe. There's a program for veterans in Seattle. Counseling. Transitional support. It's what I probably should have done years ago. He sat on the edge of the bed. Grace, no one here is stopping you from healing. In fact, we've been trying to help you do just that. She turned toward him, arms crossed tightly over her chest. That's the problem, she said, voice tight. I don't want to be someone people save. I want to save myself. Luke studied her. You've already saved people. You saved your daughters. You saved Mrs. Lambert in a blizzard. You've held this house together more than you know. That's different, she said, shaking her head. That's survival. That's instinct. I'm talking about building something real, Luke. And I can't build anything here while I'm still haunted by who I used to be. Maybe, he said softly. Or maybe you're scared that for the first time someone's asking you to stay. Not to serve, not to sacrifice, but just to be loved. The words hung in the air like a held breath. Grace looked away, jaw tightening. You think love is enough to fix someone like me? No, Luke said. But I think love can remind you that you're worth fixing. Silence again. Then faintly from the hallway, Mommy Grace closed her eyes. Her hand gripped the suitcase handle like it was a lifeline. She opened the door to find her daughters standing there, small backpacks slung over their shoulders. June held a drawing in her hand, the same one with the house and the 6 stick figures. We're ready to go, June said bravely. Grace knelt down, trying to smile. Oh, sweetheart. You don't have to. I want to stay, Ella interrupted. Grace looked up, startled. I don't want to go to another place, Ella continued. I like it here. It smells like pancakes. And the lights don't flicker when it rains. Grace's throat tightened. We made friends here, June added. We have toys that don't fit in our bags. Luke stood in the doorway watching. Grace reached for the drawing in June's hand, smoothing it out gently. The red crayon circle around Mommy looked suddenly like a spotlight. Why did you draw me like that? She asked softly. Because that's how we see you now, June said. Grace swallowed. Hard. She looked at her daughters, then back at Luke, and for the first time, she let herself say it out loud. I'm scared, Luke. I'm scared I'll stay. And fail. He stepped forward, closing the space between them. His hand rested on her shoulder, steady and warm. Failing's just part of healing, he said. But walking away from what could save you, that's a loss no one should have to carry. Grace looked into his eyes, and then slowly she let go of the suitcase handle. She didn't say anything more. She just stood there trembling as Luke pulled her into a quiet, steady embrace. No promises, no big declarations, just presence, just arms around her reminding her she wasn't alone. That night, the girls curled up in their usual blanket fort, telling Eli about their new plan to plant flowers in the snow. Luke cooked dinner. Grace sat at the kitchen table, not packing, not planning, just being. After the kids went to sleep, Grace returned to the guest room. Her suitcase was still on the floor, half zipped, half open. She left it that way. Instead, she taped the drawing to the wall beside the bed. When Luke passed by later, he saw the light still on under the door. But he didn't knock. He just smiled. Sometimes the decision to stay isn't loud. It's a whisper. It's a suitcase left unpacked. It's a picture on the wall saying, "We are a family now." The daffodils were the first sign. Little splashes of yellow poking through the thawed earth around the base of the mailbox, like spring had whispered, "It's okay to start again." Grace stood on the porch, arms crossed, a cup of coffee warming her hands, as she watched the girls chase Eli around the yard, their laughter rolling across the field like wind. It was the kind of sound she thought had been permanently erased from her world. The kind that once belonged to someone else's life, but not anymore. Luke stepped beside her holding his own mug. "Looks like the world didn't end," he said. She smirked. "Not yet." He nodded toward the flower beds. "Those girls of yours have a gift. I haven't seen anything grow out there since Marcy." Grace followed his gaze. The girls had turned the rocky garden into something close to beautiful crooked rows of tulips, pebbles arranged in shapes, even a tiny scarecrow built from popsicle sticks and yarn. They needed something to take care of, she said. Something that would stay rooted. Luke sipped his coffee quiet. "Thank you," she added softly. "For what?" "For not letting me run, for making room." He looked at her. then really looked. It wasn't charity. It was recognition. She tilted her head. Of what? Of someone who still had something left to give. She didn't reply, but her eyes said it all. A week later, Grace walked into the town's community center and left with a volunteer badge and a key to the old supply closet. It was dusty forgotten, but it had space light and potential. She spent the next 2 days sweeping, organizing, dragging folding chairs into a circle. When Luke stopped by with sandwiches, he found her on a ladder, hanging a hand-painted sign that read, "Veterans Peer Support. Thursdays, around 6 p.m. No ranks, no rules, just respect." "You really don't do anything halfway, do you?" he said, passing her a sandwich. Grace shrugged, taking a bite. "People like me, we don't need therapy buzzwords. We need chairs, a space. Coffee strong enough to dissolve trauma." "Sounds like you found your mission." She hopped off the ladder, brushed off her hands. "I didn't come here looking for one. But maybe I was never supposed to stop serving, just had to change the battlefield." He reached over and smoothed a bit of paint from her cheek. "Looks good on you, this purpose." She held his gaze a second longer than necessary. "Thanks," she said. Then, almost as an afterthought, "You should come by sometime. You don't have to be military to have ghosts." Luke chuckled. "I'll bring the coffee." Back at the house, spring cleaning had become a family affair. Eli organized books by color. June sorted mismatched socks like it was a mission from NASA. Ella declared war on dust bunnies. And Luke built something. It started as a spare tool shed. But by the weekend, it had walls, insulation shelves, even a wood-burning stove. "What is it?" Grace asked one afternoon, hands on her hips, squinting at the pinewood walls. Luke wiped sweat from his brow. "A space. For you. For the kids. For us." She raised an eyebrow. "Us?" He hesitated. "Look, I'm not proposing. Yet. But I figured, maybe we stop pretending you're temporary." Grace leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "And if I say I'm not ready for us yet," Luke nodded unbothered. "Then it's a really nice reading room." She laughed, an honest, unguarded laugh that reached all the way to her eyes. Later that night, she found a piece of paper tacked to the wall of the new room. In Luke's handwriting it read, "The family room. Open for quiet thoughts. Loud games, burnt cookies, old stories, new beginnings." She folded the paper and held it to her chest for a moment, before slipping it into her journal. In May, Grace stood in front of the town library, wearing a blue blouse and jeans, holding the hands of her 2 daughters, while Luke and Eli waited nearby. The library was hosting a hometown heroes night. She'd been nominated without her knowledge. Mrs. Lambert had sent in the story. Grace tried to escape before her name was called, but Ella tugged her hand and whispered, "Please go, Mommy. They need to see what strong looks like." So Grace stepped up. She didn't talk about war. She didn't talk about loss. She talked about rebuilding, about a man who told her, "You're coming with me," and didn't mean rescue, he meant belonging. About children who taught her to laugh again. About Montana soil and paper drawings taped to bedroom walls. She finished with one sentence. "I thought I came here to survive, but I stayed. To live." The crowd stood. Luke stood. And when she stepped down, she walked straight into his arms, not hiding, not hesitating. Just home. The morning of the wedding dawned cool and quiet. The Montana sky brushed in soft pastels, like someone had dipped their fingers in spring and painted it gently across the horizon. Grace stood barefoot on the wooden porch, still in her robe, coffee in hand. She stared at the field, where wildflowers had begun to bloom, tiny bursts of yellow lavender and white swaying in the breeze like nature's own confetti. Behind her, the house buzzed with hushed chaos. June and Ella were already in their dresses arguing over who would drop petals and who would hold the rings. Eli had taken his role as best man in charge of snacks far too seriously, and was currently restocking the lemonade table with military precision. Luke, true to form, was calm, steady, the eye in the storm of tulle and frosting. Grace didn't know how he managed to look so composed with a tie slung loose around his neck and a boutonniere made of pine and thistle pinned slightly crooked to his chest. But he did. Of course he did. She smiled, sipping her coffee, letting the warmth sink deep. She never thought this day would come, not because she didn't believe in love, but because she had stopped believing it was something she deserved. She heard the screen door creak and turned to see Mrs. Lambert shuffle out her oxygen tank, humming softly, dressed in her Sunday best and wearing a pair of sunglasses shaped like hearts. Well, she said, I lived through 2 husbands, a tornado, and disco, but I'll say this today is something special. Grace chuckled. High praise. I just came to tell you, the older woman added. Don't look too serious up there. Smile like you mean it. You've earned this. Grace nodded slowly. Thank you. Mrs. Lambert reached out, squeezed her hand. And honey, don't ever let anyone tell you this wasn't a victory. You're walking down that aisle like a general coming home. Grace blinked away sudden tears and kissed the woman's cheek. Inside, she dressed alone. No big mirror. No ivory gown with a train long enough to trip over. Just a simple fitted dress the color of wild cream, a denim jacket over her shoulders, and her army pin discreetly fastened at the collar. Her daughters entered the room just before the music started. June gasped. You look like a queen. Grace knelt down. No, sweethearts. I just look like myself. She took their hands. And that's finally enough. The ceremony was held beneath the same pine tree where Luke had once carved a heart for Marcy years ago. He'd sanded the bark smooth and carved a new one beside it now. G+L, nested in the same space, not replacing, just growing. The guests were few close neighbors, some folks from town, 3 veterans from Grace's support group who'd driven in from hours away just to see her smile in person. Ella and June scattered petals like seasoned professionals. Eli stood proud, holding a pillow with 2 wooden rings Luke had carved himself, simple, imperfect, and full of meaning. And Grace. She walked down that makeshift aisle with slow, certain steps, not afraid, not uncertain, but grounded, whole. Luke met her with a steady gaze and took her hands without hesitation. I don't have vows written down, he said, voice quiet but firm, because everything I want to promise you, I've already started doing. She smiled, eyes shimmering. Then keep doing it, she said. And I will too. The efficient Pastor Miriam from the town's tiny church declared them husband and wife, with a warmth that wrapped around everyone like a wool blanket. They kissed under the pine tree, with petals swirling and children cheering and the sky stretching wide with possibility. The reception was nothing fancy, just a few folding tables, mismatched chairs, paper lanterns, and a potluck that could feed a battalion. Grace danced with her daughters, laughing so hard her ribs ached. Luke taught Eli how to twirl a girl without stepping on her toes. At one point, someone turned off the music and Grace was handed a microphone. She tried to refuse. Then she looked around the faces that had welcomed her held space, for her, believed in her, when she couldn't believe in herself. She cleared her throat. I was a soldier, she began. I led platoons. I planned operations. I gave orders and followed them. And when it was over, I thought I'd used up all the parts of myself that mattered. She paused, but I was wrong. She looked toward Luke, then down at her girls dancing in bare feet, faces lit with joy. Because sometimes the most courageous thing you can do isn't surviving. It's loving again, trusting again, building again. Today isn't a beginning. It's a continuation. A life rebuilt with kindness one day at a time. The crowd erupted into applause, not polite, but full-hearted. Grace set the mic down and walked straight into Luke's arms. And as the sun dipped below the hills, casting gold across their backyard, two hearts once broken, once battle-worn, beat in rhythm again. Side by side. At peace. Years passed, not in a blur, but in the slow, deliberate unfolding of ordinary days, each one stitched together by laughter repair, and something that felt a lot like grace. Montana summers came and went, golden and buzzing with life. Winters settled in quietly with snow-draped rooftops and cocoa-stained mugs. The house that once stood like a shelter had become a home. Not just a roof and four walls, but a place where people belonged. Grace stood at the kitchen sink, drying a plate, while Ella and June chased Eli through the backyard. The twins had shot up like weeds, taller now, sharper in wit, but still quick to hold hands. Eli had taken to calling them his Chaos Squad, and they wore the title proudly. The radio hummed softly in the background, some old John Denver song Luke insisted on keeping in the rotation. The dog barked at nothing. The wind rustled the pine trees, and somewhere in that quiet symphony of domestic noise, Grace exhaled without realizing she'd been holding her breath. "Hey, sweetheart." Luke called from the back door, a clipboard in one hand and a pencil tucked behind his ear. "They want you to speak again. At the state veterans event this fall." "You in?" She turned, arching a brow. "Why do I feel like you already said yes for me? I might have said you'd consider it." He grinned, leaning against the doorframe. "They want to honor you. For the work you've done with the support group, the community outreach, and the fact that you're basically the town's unofficial crisis response team." Grace shook her head, amused. "I'm a glorified coffee supplier," with a loud voice. "You're a lighthouse," Luke said simply. She looked at him. Really looked. His hair had grown a little grayer around the temples. He still wore flannel-like armor. Still carved things in the shed out back when words felt too small. But more than anything, he still saw her, exactly as she was. No medals. No pretense. Just grace. "I'll think about it," she said, turning back to the sink. He stepped behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and kissed the side of her neck. "It's all I ever ask." That evening, Eli wandered into the living room carrying a small photo album, the spine worn and corners frayed. He flopped onto the couch and flipped through the pages until Grace sat beside him. "Remember this?" he asked, pointing to a snapshot of them all, on the porch, muddy, chaotic, smiling. "Of course," Grace said. "That was the day we tried to build a treehouse and ended up with a glorified ladder." Eli laughed. "You were wearing army boots and a tutu." She smirked. That was a dare. From June. They flipped through more photos, some candid, some blurry, some filled with a kind of joy, too big for frames. Eli paused on one in particular. It was the drawing Ella had made years ago, the one with the 6 stick figures and the word Mommy circled in red. "She still keeps that on her wall," Eli said quietly. Grace traced the faded crayon with her finger. "So do I." He looked up at her eyes wiser than his years. "You know you changed everything when you stayed." Grace blinked, caught off guard. "Not just for the girls," Eli continued. "For Dad. For me. For this house. You brought something back. I don't know what to call it. But it's here now." Grace pulled him into a hug, holding him close. "I didn't come here to change anything." "But you did anyway," he whispered. Later that night, after the kids were asleep and the fire had burned low, Grace stepped out onto the porch. The stars above were endless, clear, familiar. She pulled her jacket tighter and walked barefoot through the damp grass to the little garden by the shed. Tulips still bloomed there, stubborn and soft. A small wooden bench sat beneath the pine tree, the same one where she and Luke had exchanged vows. She sat down, staring up at the sky, and let the quiet settle over her like a second skin. So much had changed, and yet so much hadn't. She was still Grace, still flawed, still learning how to be soft without breaking, still a little scared, but no longer running. Behind her, Luke joined her without a word. He sat shoulder to shoulder, their silence full of shared years. "You ever wonder," she said softly, "what would have happened if you hadn't stopped at that diner?" He chuckled. "Every day." "What do you think we'd be doing now?" He thought for a moment. "I think I'd still be making bad coffee. And I think you'd still be saving people. But we'd both be lonelier, less whole." She nodded. "Funny, isn't it? How 4 words can change everything." He smiled. "You're coming with me." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. No regrets. Not one. And in that quiet Montana night, beneath a sky wide enough to hold every version of who they had been and every possibility of who they still could become, Grace closed her eyes. Not to sleep, but to remember, to feel, to be alive. Home. Loved. Before you go, we'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Share your city, your country. Or just say hello in the comments. It means more than you know. If this story touched your heart, and you believe the world could use more kindness, please consider subscribing to our channel. We share stories that remind us of what truly matters. Love, family, and the quiet strength of everyday people. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Take care of yourself and each other. We'll see you in the next story.